So that's kind of the hormone story. Hormones are critical all through development. They really are the developmental molecules, how I like to talk about them. Excuse me. But that doesn't necessarily explain our initial question. I'm going to go a few slides back. Why are teenagers like this? Just saying puberty isn't enough to explain why teenagers have all those properties that Elkin described. Why, for instance, teenagers have an imaginary audience problem, or an invincibility illusion or personal fable problem. So, we're on this slide now. Emotion outpaces cognition around puberty. This is a fairly modern result. So in the last 15 years, they've really been unpacking this. This is called the mismatch model of adolescent psychology, and it's a great name because that's exactly what it is. It's about how the limbic system, which does a lot of the especially negative emotions, is more advanced than the prefrontal cortex, which is basically designed to keep that in check, to direct behavior in a more rational way rather than a purely emotion-driven way. This works pretty well prior to puberty, but the problem is at puberty, the limbic system, which is about, again, that deep emotional resonance, it's about emotional processing, anger and sadness and so forth. That region has more receptors in it sensitive to pubertal hormones than the prefrontal cortex does. So when puberty happens, it gets activated more than the prefrontal cortex gets activated, meaning that the negative emotion center of the brain becomes more mature faster than the part that's designed to rein it in. So at puberty, we have a mismatch. We have a limbic system that's more advanced than the prefrontal cortex that's designed to control it. And so if you look at this graph, there's this one line for the limbic regions, one line for prefrontal regions, and when adolescence hits is when these lines are maximally separated. And what that allows for is this hyper-emotional responsivity to normal social cues, to normal social things in the world. To risk, for instance. It becomes more important to be cool and to not be cool among your friends and do the drag racing than it is to be safe. Your prefrontal cortex is trying to say, hey, don't go drag racing, but because it's so less advanced than the limbic system is saying, no, it's much more important to mitigate this social disaster that happens if I chicken out, right? So that's the so-called mismatch model. What this explains is why at puberty there's this big jump in risky behavior in particular, and this big jump in emotional responsivity to normal stuff in particular that isn't there prior when you're a young child and doesn't remain there after puberty. Of course, again, this is a model about averages. Some people will experience this less, some people will experience this more and be stuck in this kind of way of acting for a longer period, but that's not to say that this model isn't quite informative. Okay, so that's the mismatch model, and that kind of explains why teenagers are the way they are to an extent. All right, so that's our day. So now I'm just going to walk through a summary of what we learned. So infants are born into a world they can barely see, and as time goes on, they become able to see things more clearly. And as that happens, what becomes evident is that they come with these sort of built-in tricks to figure out what things are important in the world. Biases, baby biases, especially towards faces, towards human faces, which are, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a super important source of information because we are social primates. Sorry. And as these perceptual biases go on, infants become more and more sensitive to more and more fine-grained distinctions in the world. They go through different stages, according to Piaget anyway, where during the early period they're performing these little sensory motor experiments. And as time goes on, hopefully they progress into different stages where they become better able to use logic, more able to use it on more abstract concepts and so forth. But in the first couple of years, infants are stuck in this sensory motor period where they're performing little experiments in their world. If I kick the mobile, this happens. If I babble, this happens. If I cry, this happens. And they become sensitive to all this. And it also influences their emotional attachment to their caregivers. It's a very deep process in the developing infant. As the infant develops into a child, okay, and indeed into an adolescent, changes in cognition occur. And when it comes to working memory, or the ability to hold things in mind, this improves generally over the lifespan. So for some people more than others, but on average it improves. And the cognitive improvement that's most central to humans is language acquisition. Starting around a year, kids are able to say their first word, although they are babbling and cooing and so forth prior to that and starting to gesture. But once that first word happens, it's kind of a downstream run, because 9 words a day need to somehow get into that kid's head. And so it's these sensory motor experiments and babbling and listening and so forth, this passive acquisition of the statistics of language that allows a kid to develop into a speaking, rational adult. This is kind of what makes us an interesting ape, right? It's why we're able to make lectures like this, why we're able to advance scientifically and, go to the moon. It's because we're able to speak to each other. This doesn't just stop with infant word learning. Around 18 to 24 months, 2 to 3 word phrases start occurring, and of course this just improves over lifespan so that syntax and grammar get in there eventually. Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop for today. I will be posting your assignment, and it's going to be on Google Drive. Okay, I will also be posting these slides, and you can get into contact with me through your instructor, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Have a great day.